Hello, this is Annie Rogers, and on behalf of Attitude Magazine, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's ADHD Experts broadcast with Dr. Bianca Acevedo on the topic of sensory processing sensitivity and ADHD. Sensory processing sensitivity, or SPS, is the formal diagnosis for what we call a highly sensitive person. Someone who's easily overwhelmed by bright lights, strong smells, coarse fabrics, loud sirens. It could even be someone who gets rattled when they have a lot to do in a short amount of time. Approximately 20 to 30% of the population has SPS, according to recent studies, and the propensity is even higher among people with ADHD. The overlap with ADHD is clear. The inability to control emotions, being more easily overwhelmed and overstimulated, struggling with low self-esteem. These are all symptoms of being a highly sensitive person. So in today's webinar, we're going to learn about the symptoms of SPS, how it affects the brain, how ADHD behaviors can contribute to SPS, and how to manage SPS alongside ADHD. Leading our conversation today, we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Bianca Acevedo. She is a researcher at the University of California in Santa Barbara in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences. She's an internationally recognized expert in sensory processing sensitivity, love, and attachment. She co-authored and edited the recently released book called The Highly Sensitive Brain. She's the developer of the Love Smart app and was the recipient of the 2012 International Women in Science Award. You can learn more about her and reach her at biancaacevedo.com. So before I hand over the mic and get started, I just wanted to take care of a few housekeeping items. Those of you tuned in to the live webinar, you may download the slides now by clicking on the Event Resources section of your webinar screen. And if you are interested in the Certificate of Attendance option, look for instructions in an email from Attitude that you will receive about an hour after we wrap up the live broadcast. Those of you who are listening in replay or podcast mode, you can find the accompanying slides and the Certificate of Attendance information by visiting attitudemag.com and searching for podcast number 333. So without further ado, Dr. Acevedo, thank you so much for joining us today, and I will hand over the mic for this great presentation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here with all of you. I know that most of you are interested in ADHD, and a lot of my collaborators have gone into that territory because of the some of the overlapping symptoms with high sensitivity. So there is some overlap, but they are distinct, and hopefully I can share with you a little bit of my knowledge about sensory processing sensitivity and clarify for some of you what these different symptoms are. And this may be helpful for you, for yourself, or if you're dealing with your children or with your friends or your close partners, to kind of have a better sense of what the two things are so that you can navigate life a little bit more smoothly. So first, I'm going to start off with an explanation of what sensory processing sensitivity is. It's going to be a little bit scientific. So I'll get into what some of the different theories are and what some of the biology associated with is, as well as what some of the general characteristics. So what in humans, high sensitivity is associated with behaviorally, emotionally, and physically. Then I'll share with you a little bit about some of the neuroimaging studies that we've done. And finally, I'll end with a short comparison of ADHD and high sensitivity in terms of what we know about them biologically and what the symptoms are. Okay, so let's get started. So high sensitivity, sensory processing sensitivity, also sometimes referred to more recently as environmental sensitivity, is a biologically based trait that is observed in over 100 species as one of two behavioral strategies. One of the strategies is being careful, being attentive, being reflective, being sensitive, pausing before acting, versus being the first to act, impulsive, and the like. And these behavioral strategies are observed in a wide spectrum of species, from fruit flies to humans. So in fruit flies, the way that it's been observed is if there's some sort of novel stimulus that's put in a jar, and most of the fruit flies will go and approach this novel stimulus, but there are a few that are, stay on the sidelines, they're careful, they're reflective, and they don't necessarily approach right away. In humans, we see this as well as and also in a variety of other species. So in humans, sensory processing sensitivity has been characterized as being associated with a deeper cognitive processing, attention to subtleties, emotional reactivity, both for better and for worse, being easily stimulated, and having a greater awareness of environmental and other stimuli, like social stimuli, like being more affected by other people's moods and their emotions. So historically, sensory processing sensitivity has been referred to in a variety of different ways. So in different fields ranging from human development to biology to social psychology, personality psychology, scientists have studied traits that are related to sensitivity, but they've called them different things. So the different names that they've been given across these different fields are things like responsivity, plasticity, arousability, flexibility. Highly sensitive people have also been referred to as being introverted. And there was a lot of confusion early on about introversion and high sensitivity. Also, temperament theorists have associated empathy in similar ways, such as referring to effortful control of emotions, effortful control in response to others, pausing of the behavioral inhibition system, which allows the organism to take time to reflect before acting, to process others' emotions, to process what's going on in the environment, versus being impulsive. Also, more recently in biology, different theories have been outlined to describe these different behavioral characteristics. And these theories, like differential susceptibility and biological sensitivity to context, have observed and proposed that individuals with this trait are more responsive to their environments, both for better and for worse. So in positive environments, they display good health, they display social competence, creativity, empathy, and the like. But in negative environments, or if they've had negative childhoods, they experience a variety of negative symptoms, ranging from fatigue and exhaustion to anxiety, depression, lower life and work satisfaction, digestion issues, and the like. And although these different fields had started to describe the trait in different ways. It wasn't until Dr. Elaine Aron came to the field and really coined the term the highly sensitive person. So she started off by noticing that being highly sensitive herself, that some individuals were more sensitive to things, and that they didn't have a disorder, they weren't sick in any way. They were just more responsive to things in their environment and to other people. So she started interviewing people, and from that work, she developed a scale that's been widely used now called the Highly Sensitive Person Scale, that measures things relating to response to different stimuli, things like asking people about how they respond to strong smells or coarse fabrics or loud sounds or sirens, to other things like feeling nervous when having a lot to do at the same time, or when having to compete, or when being observed, as well as being affected by other people's moods, which kind of gets at this, the empathy factor that we'll be talking more about as I go along. And more recently, a highly sensitive child scale has also been developed to assess sensitivity in children and adolescents. And it's available for the child to respond to these different questions and assess their sensitivity, as well as parents and teachers. There's a parent and teacher version. And what this scale has showed is that the trait is, although it's one trait, there are different factors that are associated with it. And the way that it emerged is having these three different components that the researchers refer to as aesthetic sensitivity, so being sensitive and being responsive to pleasant things like nice scents and nice music and beautiful scenery, artwork, things of that nature, and having also a low sensory threshold. So, having a low threshold for stimuli in the environment, as well as ease of excitation. So after being exposed to different things, being aroused. So getting more nervous, being more sensitive to caffeine, feeling nervous when having to do too many things at once. And scientists have also started to examine about how many people in the population are highly sensitive. And some of the earlier work has found that approximately 20% of the population falls into a category of being very highly sensitive. And they coin these individuals orchids, because orchids are, they're fragile. They are very responsive to small changes in their environment versus dandelions that are much hardier. And they found that about 80% of any given population was in the lower sensitivity category. But more recent work has shown that there may actually be three groups of sensitive people, where some people fall into the highly sensitive group coined as orchids, and that's about 30% of the population, and as well as the 30% that are the less sensitive group. And interestingly, some of this research has shown that about 40% of a population falls into a moderate sensitivity group. And although this is interesting to know, for researchers and also for all of us, it's a good thing to know that we've started to recommend to people that when they're looking at sensitivity in research, to not place people in categories, but to think of it as a continuum from low to high. Because we can kind of push sensitivity around a little bit, like if you're it's an innate biological trait. There is some genetic evidence of it, as well as biological evidence. And some of the genetic work suggests that about 40% of sensitivity is heritable. So the other part is accounted for by environment. So you can kind of move it around a little bit depending on what the person does, what kinds of activities they engage in, whether they're and how they express the trait, whether in, if the context is positive or negative, their upbringing, all of this affects how the system responds to the environment. And I'll be talking about that a little bit more in some of this work. So here I'll describe some of the brain imaging studies of high sensitivity. And although a few studies have been done, I'll be focusing on two, one of them being a study of empathy. So people were brought into the lab and they were shown different face stimuli and given empathy scenarios and asked to respond to it. They also took the highly sensitive person scale and we looked at how their brain responses were affected as a function of their sensitivity. And in the second study, they saw general positive, negative, and neutral face images. So in the first study that was conducted here at the University of California in Santa Barbara, individuals were brought into the lab and they were asked to, while they were in the fMRI scanner, which measures changes in blood flow, in oxygen. And these changes in blood flow are interpreted as being areas that are more active. And while they were in the scanner, they were given these different scenarios. They were given an empathy task for strangers and for their partner. And it involved reading a short blurb followed by a corresponding face image, and then a 4-digit number where they were asked to count backwards in their head by 7. So it's, the purpose of the task is just to wash away any emotional response to the empathy task. And so they were asked to read something like, this person is feeling very happy because something wonderful has happened to them, followed by a corresponding face image of the partner or a stranger smiling. And then after viewing the image for a few seconds, they were shown a large number and instructed to count backwards by 7s. And for the empathy test, they were asked to please allow themselves to respond to the situation the way they normally would. And this study was really important because it started to show us what some of the areas of the brain that are associated with sensory processing sensitivity are that hadn't been observed before. And one of the key findings is that it showed that the anterior insula was playing a role in high sensitivity. So when individuals were viewing the partner and the stranger's emotional images, they showed more activation in the anterior insula of the brain as a function of their sensitivity. And the insula it's an interesting region because it's associated with emotional processing. It's associated with visceral sensations like the gut feelings that you get with empathy. And some researchers have even speculated that it's the seat of human awareness or consciousness. This study was also interesting because it showed some of the other key characteristics of high sensitivity. So it showed that when people were looking at happy images of the partner, they were showing more activation in areas related to bodily sensations, such as the primary somatosensory cortex. Interestingly, when they're seeing their partner smile and reflecting on the partner's happiness, they show more activation in the key dopamine area of the brain called the ventral tegmental area, and the VTA it's associated with motivation. It's an area that has a lot of receptors for dopamine, which are associated with energy, feelings of euphoria, working for rewards. So just looking at a partner smiling activates the VTA, and it does so to a greater extent as a function of sensitivity. So the people who are more sensitive show even more activation in this key reward area of the brain in response to their partner's happiness, in line with theories of differential susceptibility and biological sensitivity to context, which suggests that highly sensitive people are more affected by things for better and for worse. So in positive environments, in positive situations, they show stronger effects in response to these things, as well as in the reverse situation. So they also show evidence of depth of processing. So in response to both the partner's happiness and the partner's sadness, they show more activity in areas related to cognitive processing, reflective thinking, and perspective taking. In a second study, we looked at the response to general emotional stimuli, so positive, negative stimuli from the International Affective Picture System, which has been widely used in emotions research. So for positive things, they saw, for example, things of people laughing, of social groups, of nice cars, things that most people like. Neutral images, things like an umbrella or dustpan. Some of us may not think this is that neutral. I don't. And for negative images, they saw these, really grotesque things like dead animals or animals suffering and so forth. And what was interesting about this study was that we also measured childhood environment with a battery of 7 different scales that we used to develop a childhood environment index. So these were adults that were brought in to the Brain Imaging Center at Stony Brook University in New York, and they were shown these various different emotional stimuli and asked to also complete the highly sensitive person scale. And what we found was, again, evidence of differential susceptibility. So in response to positive things like people smiling and nice cars, they show more activity in this key reward center of the ventral tegmental area with increasing sensitivity. So those people that are more sensitive show more reward activity in response to positive images, but even to a greater extent if they had reported having had a positive childhood. And in response to negative images, they showed more activation in the amygdala and the hippocampus, which are important for emotion and memory, and to even a greater extent as a function of their childhood environment. And interestingly, again, in line with differential susceptibility theory and biological sensitivity to context, when these individuals were shown negative images, they actually showed a decrease in this key reward center of the VTA. They actually show a lower activity in this area. But what was really interesting was that when we accounted for their childhood environment, those that had had a positive childhood did not show this effect. So they were buffered from the impact of the negative stimuli. And instead, what they showed was a pattern of brain activation associated with self-regulation and cognitive processing. So now I'll discuss a little bit about how ADHD and SPS are similar and they're different. So according to the American Psychiatric Association, ADHD is a childhood onset neuropsychiatric disorder characterized by attention problems, hyperactivity, and impulsivity, and it can seriously affect people's interpersonal and academic performance. It could seriously impact their, all of their life, of course. And sensitivity is proposed to be a biological temperament trait that, as we highlighted in this talk, is associated with deeper cognitive processing, attention to subtleties, pausing before acting, emotional reactivity, and empathy. So these two constructs are similar to the extent that people may show emotional reactivity and overstimulation. And they may be confused sometimes because of that. So, for example, when children are overwhelmed or they're really tired, they may not always just zonk out. Sometimes when kids are overstimulated, they show hyperactivity. So a highly sensitive child can indeed show some of the symptoms that are associated with ADHD, like hyperactivity. But generally, they won't display impulsivity. So highly sensitive children are they're more reflective. They pause before acting. They're more empathic. So they won't necessarily show the impulsivity that characterizes ADHD. But both of them can, of course, hinder interpersonal and academic performance. So if a highly sensitive child is in too much of an overstimulating environment or a negative environment or a harsh environment, their social competence, their academic performance, their emotional well-being and their health will be impacted negatively. So both of these constructs can be impacted in negative ways depending on the situation. So there may be overlap and confusion across the two, but some of the things that, to kind of keep an eye out for in terms of, if you have children, if you have partners, when you're thinking about them, is the deeper cognitive processing and the, pausing before acting. That will help you to get a sense of whether the person is, if they're highly sensitive and they're just overstimulating or reacting to their environment in some way, or whether they have ADHD. And brain imaging studies also help us to get some clarity about what's going on with these two different things, with ADHD and SPS. So the general consensus about ADHD in recent times, after numerous studies have been done, including meta-analyses, is that ADHD is associated with abnormality. So less activation generally in areas that are related to cognitive processing. So self-regulation, attention, inhibition. While sensory processing sensitivity actually shows more activation in areas related to self-regulation, homeostatic regulation of physiology, of hormones, of cognition, of enhanced awareness and empathy, and cognitive depth of processing. So it's helpful to know that even though behaviorally there are overlapping characteristics for these two constructs, that they are distinct. That's not to say that somebody who's highly sensitive can't also have ADHD. So people who are highly sensitive show a variety of medical issues in response to negative environments. As we've had, specifically as adults, they'll tend to report more stress, more anxiety, more depression, and also social issues like social phobia, introversion. But that's generally in response to the context and also if they've experienced a negative childhood. So in summary, I hope that all of you learned something about high sensitivity, and that you learned something about the biology and the science associated with it, as well as better understanding how it might be related to ADHD. And if you're interested in learning more, if you're a researcher, a teacher, a clinician, or in a medical field, you might benefit from having the Highly Sensitive Brain Handbook that details a lot of this, goes into more depth, provides information about assessment, including a chapter for clinicians, and a chapter on other overlapping related disorders like sensitivity to sound and so forth. Great, thank you for coming. And if you have any questions, please feel free to enter them now.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Acevedo, for that very thorough overview on sensory processing sensitivity and ADHD. We do have a number of questions that have come in during the presentation, so I'll do my best to touch on as many as possible. One that we heard quite a lot was people inquiring about whether there's research on the connection between SPS and trauma. Some people asked about, specifically PTSD, others about children who may have experienced trauma in their early years, and whether that could have an impact on their having SPS later in life.
Yeah, that's a great question. We haven't done research directly on SPS and PTSD. I and collaborators published a paper comparing the brain correlates of sensitivity and PTSD in a review paper a few years ago. So that's the closest that we've come. And indeed, there are areas that overlap between SPS and PTSD. And there are, of course, areas that are distinct. And I would say that most importantly, we've done recently a brain connectivity study. And one of the key things that differentiates high sensitivity with PTSD, and that's not to say that somebody who's highly sensitive cannot have PTSD. Of course, people that are highly sensitive experience trauma. And perhaps they process it to an even deeper degree than other people. So people that are highly sensitive generally they show more activity in areas related to emotion, to memory, that of course are pivotal for post-traumatic stress. But one of the key things that they show, and when they're given a chance to rest, so they're not looking at faces, they're not looking at emotional pictures, they're just given a chance to rest, which is critical for all of us, but especially for highly sensitive people, is that they show more resting state brain connectivity in networks that are related to deliberative cognitive processing, not habitual processing, which is characteristic of PTSD, right? So the person who's experienced trauma may see something or something related to whatever the traumatic incident was, and automatically their system reacts in a habitual way to the stimulus. While people that are more sensitive, although they may be more impacted by things in their environment, when they're given the chance to rest, instead of showing some of the habitual circuits, they show more deliberative cognitive processing associated with the depth of processing. So we haven't done any research that directly looks at the relationship between PTSD and high SPS. And some people have suggested that perhaps there's some sort of vulnerability for highly sensitive people to become more traumatized. And theory would predict that as well, because they're more impacted by things, both for better and for worse. So in the moment, they may be more responsive to the situation, but given the chance to reflect and to process the information, that's what may be key. Also, there's evidence that people that are more sensitive, specifically adolescents, are more responsive to positive interventions, cognitive behavioral interventions. Currently, there's research going on all over the world on this, and people are starting to examine whether highly sensitive people are more responsive to meditation, whether they're more responsive to yoga, whether they're more responsive to mindfulness, whether they're more responsive to cognitive behavioral interventions. So in the upcoming years, we'll have a better handle on all of this. But I think it's an important question, and I hope that we get to address it soon.
Very interesting. Yeah, there were a number of questions about treatment, and specifically whether there's any research on the use of stimulant medications, common obviously among people with ADHD, and whether that exacerbates or in any way inflames, SPS.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So what we know from some of the neuroimaging work and the seed, of the genetic work and work with animals, we're just starting to get a handle on what the physiology and genetic basis is of the trait. Is that it affects, so far some of the key players appear to be the serotonergic system and the dopamine system. So I'm not sure that anybody has looked at how different pharmaceutical medications may impact sensitivity, But what we do know is that highly sensitive people are more affected by everything. So they're going to respond to whatever they're given.
Right. Number of people wondering if occupational therapy makes sense as a next step if they suspect that their specifically their child with diagnosed ADHD seems to be, showing signs of SPS. Kind of what you would recommend for a next step in treatment.
Well, I would recommend looking at the environment first, because if the child is highly sensitive, to first try to make the environment as conducive to their sensitivity. So, highly sensitive people tend to do well in environments that are calm and orderly, and I think we all do better that way, but especially highly sensitive children and nurturing. So first, addressing some of the contextual things that may be exacerbating the ADHD.
Right. That makes sense. And I assume, that's universal for both children and adults. You said that earlier in your presentation, 40% roughly of sensitivity is inherited and 60% is environmental. So along those lines, we also had some questions about exactly those environmental impacts, whether kind of what specifically maybe caregivers or adults could do to tip the environmental scale in their favor with SPS. Is it, what can parents do to help intervene and change the environment for the better?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, keeping things calm and orderly and pleasant to the senses with not too much going on, but also diet is really important for keeping the child or the person well regulated. So not too much sugar, not too much caffeine, not too many things that will overstimulate the person. And having a discussion about emotions is always, helpful. And children understand this early on, like understanding them how they feel about things and letting them express themselves so that they start to have a vocabulary for different events in their lives and for how they feel.
Right. We did get a number of questions from adults who have ADHD and are, it's common for emotional dysregulation and even rejection sensitive dysphoria to be kind of part and parcel with ADHD. And they're wondering, how do you parse these out from SPS? The emotional dysregulation, could that be mistaken for SPS? What are some ways to figure out whether you are dealing with both of those conditions? And how might your, the way that you address it from a treatment standpoint change?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So definitely, we can all kind of experience rejection sensitivity and emotion dysregulation. And I would suggest that, to start to just kind of take the scale. You can go online and take the scale to determine how sensitive you are. But also, what's different from these conditions is that highly sensitive individuals tend to show, positive environments, and if they've had good, stable childhoods, more self-regulation. And the immediate response to things is normal to feel rejected. It's a normal response that we experience as human, but the extent and length of the response is also what's different. And I would also think about different things like, empathy, depth of processing, attention to subtleties, some of the more positive characteristics of the trait to try to understand whether whether you're highly sensitive or not. And some of the things that may help in if it's related to high sensitivity is some sort of practice that helps with resilience, with self-esteem, with self-regulation. In adolescence, some cognitive behavioral interventions were shown to help with depression specifically. But what we see with meditative and yogic practices is that it enhances self-regulatory capacities and areas of the brain related to self-regulation. So I would recommend that to start, some sort of yogic or meditative practice to help if the person is highly sensitive and experiencing these different symptoms.
Gotcha. Okay, that's may also answer another question, which I thought was a great one. An educator asking how they could help students who are highly sensitive during this time of online learning. The visual and auditory, overstimulation can be a real issue. So perhaps working, some mindfulness into the daily curriculum. Of course, it's hard to police that remotely, but that could be a solution. I know many educators are using that in a live environment these days to help all sorts of students. So perhaps that could be a solution in the virtual realm as well. Someone's asking about somatic therapy and whether that has been explored as a treatment for individuals with SPS. We've done some work on that. So we have some articles about its use for ADHD and specifically those who have experienced trauma. They're wondering if it's also applicable for SPS.
I'm not aware of any work that's looked at that kind of therapy and SPS.
Okay. So
but
further,
I would say, highly sensitive people are more responsive to everything. So it's like, if it's a positive, if they perceive it to be positive, then it will most likely impact them positively. But it's just, it just depends. For highly sensitive people, if I'm not aware of any work looking at that, yeah.
Gotcha. Is there any difference in gender with SPS? Women or men more likely to have it?
We're not aware of any gender differences other than sociocultural differences in what is acceptable, what are the social norms, how culture influences sensitivity. And in recent times, specifically for men, people have started to really shine a light on it, given that it's associated with the characteristics that may not always be endorsed in males, like being sensitive, being aware and attuned to emotions and to aesthetic things. And so for men that are highly sensitive in previous times, it was not an easy thing, because a lot of things that were in their and were in their nature were things that they were most likely shunned for or asked to turn off. But in more recent times, with gender becoming more fluid and with people becoming more aware of the trait, it's become much more accepted for men to display their sensitive qualities.
I want to circle back quickly because I'm reviewing the questions as we go. And when we were talking a moment ago about emotional dysregulation and RSD, you mentioned a scale to kind of rate your sensitivity. And quite a few people are asking about how to access that scale.
Yeah, so the scale is available online. If you go to hspperson.com, you can also, if you download the LoveSmart app, you can complete it on your phone. And all of the scales for adults and for children and assessment and description of how to do all of that, it's available in the Highly Sensitive Brain book.
Gotcha. Okay, wonderful. That was a common question after that segment. Let's see. We do have some questions just regarding the finer points of differentiation between SPS and sensory processing disorder, as well as sensory integration disorder. I wonder if you could outline the distinctions there.
Yeah, well, sensory processing disorder is exactly that. It's a disorder associated with dysregulation in response to different stimuli. And SPS is not a disorder. SPS is a trait that is associated with the deeper cognitive processing of information. It's not associated with dysregulation to sensory stimuli, but to the extent that the environment and the person's system experiences these stimuli, it can become overstimulated. And generally, highly sensitive people, in response to feeling overwhelmed or being overstimulated, they usually respond by feeling like needing more downtime to rest. And probably because they want to engage in, some processing to digest the information that they've just been exposed to. And they may not at all experience disorganization or dysregulation in response to things, rather just experiencing them in a more amplified way.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Okay. Number of questions on whether there is a relationship between SPS and general anxiety disorder.
There is. Well, they're not the same thing, but highly sensitive people in response to their environment or in response to having had a challenging childhood report higher levels of anxiety.
Okay. So some kind of a, relation.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. So I can say this is a topic of high interest, as we are up to almost 500 questions. So, I apologize to those of you whose questions have not been asked. I'm doing my best to sort of, combine them as best I can. But there is a lot. And let's see, what have we not touched on here? Some people are wondering if, highly sensitive person is used almost interchangeably with adult ADHD, and they're wondering if that's a core symptom of adult ADHD, what might signal to them that they should look further than just their ADHD diagnosis?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I've met several people in my life who told me, I have ADHD, or I have this ADHD diagnosis. And then in talking more with them, I realized, they don't have ADHD. They're highly sensitive, and they're just overwhelmed. They're responding to the environment and feeling overstimulated. So I think what I would start to do is I would take one of the scales and find out more about sensitivity to understand if they have the trait. So some of the key things that I described during the presentation was depth of processing. Are they processing information more deeply? If they think about themselves, if they, don't only take if they don't only take a snapshot of the here and now, but if they think about themselves as children, do they remember themselves as children being more reflective, being more careful, not being, wanting to be the first to act, being more empathic towards others, like feeling others' emotions and being responsive to others. And if that's the case, if they in the here and now, and if they recall themselves as being this way as children, I would recommend to them to look more into high sensitivity, and how to start to manage their highly sensitive systems, so that they become more regulated and so that they're not experiencing symptoms related to inability to focus and hyperactivity.
Gotcha. And we are just nearing the hour, but that leads into another common question that we got. So I'll end with this one, and that is there any research on whether SPS is more common among individuals with inattentive ADHD as opposed to the hyperactive impulsive ADHD?
I'm not aware of any research in that area, but it seems like a very useful direction for research to take.
Yes, we have a number of inquiries that precisely what you were talking about, being a little more introspective and empathetic, is perhaps more closely aligned with the inattentive type. I don't want to get into stereotypes too much, but yes. So wonderful. Well, I hate to wrap this up because we do have such a great interest in this topic, but this was a wonderful an informative introduction to sensory processing sensitivity. Thank you so much, Dr. Acevedo, for your session today. We greatly appreciate your time and expertise, and also thank you to our listeners, and I would encourage you to also join us for our next ADHD Experts webinar, which is taking place live next Tuesday, the 24th of November, and that is with Dr. Joel Nigg, and he'll be discussing ADHD, anger, tantrums, and mood shifts. So also on this emotional spectrum. That
Great.
is all of our time for today, but thank you again so much for joining us, and we hope to see everyone again soon.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was my pleasure. Thanks. Bye.